Right, to provide more analysis, we're joined from Brussels by Ms. Kamila Zawichta-Romanow, Professor of EU Law and Security Studies, and from Marbella by Mr. Meher Nicholas Ferzilli, Director of EU Asian Centre. Welcome to both of you, and starting with Ms. Kamila, and can the EU's drone wall truly be operational by 2027 without a dedicated budget or binding legal framework?
Well, actually, I have to surprise, I think, many people to reply yes. And why? Because the plan is built as a federated capability that stitches together national systems via common EU-NATO interfaces, financed primarily by member states and existing EU instruments. For instance, as you already mentioned, interoperability on the external border. The Commission proposal, now cast as a European Drone Defence Initiative, sets initial capability indeed by the end of 2026 and full functionality by end of 2027. And this is actually something quite spectacular, I would say, because this package sits inside the broader roadmap, the four flagships: border defence, which is already working within the Frontex and Copernicus; drone defence, which is already starting to be created on the border by Frontex and by European police cooperation and the border support; air defence and space. They are actually now going to be joined together. And from this, let's say, little strings, something is going to be created, which will be expressly designed to be NATO interoperable, which is absolutely new. The money will flow is truly hybrid indeed, because both national budget and targeted EU envelopes, for instance, via EDP, via European Defence Fund, or other, rather than a single new monolithic fund, which will make it more complicated. But politically, that lowers the bar to start. And technically, it's enough to federate sensors, CA2 and CUAS effectors now, then scale up, because it will be difficult now to ensure broad unity. And that's a good beginning, I would say.
Right. Mr. Ferzilli, as Europe militarizes its economy, will its 60% local procurement rule isolate it isolated from global partners like Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN, for an instant?
I'm delighted to join you today from Marbella. Listen, I think there are many things here, but to make a long story short, the ASEAN, right? The ASEAN countries have never been essential military industrial partners to the Europeans. So that rule will not impact that side of the argument. But there's another side of the argument, which is Britain, the UK, and the US. So for most European countries who are in the business of producing weapons, right? Let alone, buying weapons, but I would say only 20 or 15% of European member states have some kind of military industry, apart perhaps from the French. The Italians, the German, the Polish, the Dutch, they're all heavily integrated with British and even more American weapon manufacturing companies. So what I'm coming at, that 60% local procurement is a fiction. It's a big lie. In reality, that will be, a lot of that 60% will be made in England or America, not really made in Europe. And so who will profit? A lot of the money paid by European taxpayers will go in the coffers of British and even more American companies. So once more, there's a lot of propaganda, 60% local procurement. We are going to jumpstart the native, homegrown, domestic European arms industry. In reality, it will only profit to Germany, a little bit of Italy, Poland, France, but for the most part, it will be a big profit for American companies and British companies.
Right. Ms. Kamila, is empowering the European Defence Agency a step towards strategic autonomy or just symbolic centralization? And what do you have to what Mr. Ferzilli said, that it's not really it would not be really functioning for the sake of Europe?
Well, first of all, when it comes to the EDA and its strategic autonomy or symbolic centralization, I would actually say that this practical autonomy is actually through the scale, not centralization as such, because EDIS setting targets like this already discussed collaborative procurement and buy-in EU shares, and EDP providing regulatory and financial chassis. But EDA's role, European Defence Agency role, is to aggregate demand, publish common specification standards, and facilitate multi-stake framework contract, while budget, force structure, and deployment remain national. That will be indeed a challenge. But that's how you could cut the duplication and lock in interoperability without violating sovereignty. This is something European Union is actually quite quietly investing for a long time. This is something which we can see with a CART, Coordinated Annual Review of Defence. It already aligns national plans with EU priorities and flags concrete collaboration projects, and EDA turns those opportunities into tenders or agreements industry can actually build up against. The step Europe use not to be missed, because in this situation, and in certain extent, I absolutely agree with Mr. Fazil, we need to ensure that there will be a standard as gatekeepers, because to make EDA or NATO interface profiles, for instance, sensor or C2 or CUAS, it's a hard requirement. We buy into the standards, not into a brand. This is something really important, and this is where EDA standards are setting a bit more matters. I have to say that actually I am quite into the procurement, especially in defense matter when it comes to the European Union, because we have here a certain aspects we should take into account. For instance, incentive and cooperation, because Carrot and Bambam in RFX, evaluation credits for collaborative bids, cross-border workshare, EU production footprints, and export control alignments that keeps kit deployable within the NATO. Important issues as well, BAT and administrative facilitation and advanced purchase agreement. These are classic cost of capital levers that steal the economics toward joint buyouts. Exactly what should be EDIP philosophy. More importantly, there is a transparency loop. We've published scoreboards by capability family, who buys jointly, who meets those standards, those shares, and who still buys solo. This will actually create the pressure in council or EDA works to ask procurement directors who will be in charge of competitive benchmarking. That's the reason why it is going to be a challenge. But in my opinion, when it comes to the variable we can do as a contract management, we can see the possibilities to actually ensure that, for instance, there will be mini competition under the framework or direct call-offs when specs are unchanged that will reserve open procedures for new capabilities. We can see as well procure loop like Thai, EU, and NATO exercise, but in the immediate cooperative procurement through the framework like Red Team, FX, BUY, etc. This is how we turn ops feedback into the order fast. And this is something which is very important in NATO history, century, and EU roadmap gives those venues. That's really something which will make the procurement a little bite. Of course, there are going to be risk, especially when it comes to compliance and geopolitics, designed into, but not bottled up on, especially when it comes, already mentioned very smartly by Mr. Director of Hazari, export control and ITAR region, for instance, because the pre-clear text check of stacks is something which we should ensure there will be avoided downstream of the ITAR traps or cripple EU NATO deployability. We need to make sure that supply chain transparency will be condition of the award as a first thing.
All right, Mr. Fazeli, with Trump pushing allies to pay up and buy US arms, can Europe's strategic autonomy survive transatlantic pressure?
So I think, it's a fiction. So Europe's strategic autonomy, and even the concept of interoperability, EU army, blah, 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 joint procurement, these are all big words hiding propaganda to a large extent. Why? For a very simple reason. And it's linked, to the latest episode in that propaganda machine is the drone war, right? All of a sudden, all these sort of EU federalist propagandists On top of them, of course, Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels, they came up with the idea of a drone wall, and they used as a pretext the supposedly Russian drone attacks on Denmark, Holland, and Poland 3 weeks ago, and nothing proves. I mean, it may have been Russian drones coming from Belarus or Russian boats in the Atlantic or the North Sea. It may also have been false flag, false flag operations engineered by the likes of Ursula von der Leyen and NATO. Who knows? But they used these very small incidents and they blew them out of proportion. Oh my God, the Russians are coming with armies of drones. And here we are, 3 weeks later, with a new project invented by von der Leyen, Macron, and Zelensky, which will require tens of billions of euros of spending, euros which Europe doesn't have. Economic growth today in Europe is close to 0.1% per annum. Inflation is high. The European economy is collapsing. We cannot afford another folly. And so it's an example of what they're saying. And what's fascinating about the drone wall, they are, and it's not a joke, so they are saying seriously. Initially, when I read that 2 days ago, I thought it was a joke, but they're saying seriously, without joking, that they're taking their inspiration from a French defense minister called André Maginot. And actually, André Maginot was a 1928-29 failed French politician. He was a European federalist before Macron and von der Leyen, but he was a failed defense minister who came up with a very expensive idea of the Maginot Line, supposedly protecting Holland, Belgium, and France from the Germans, which was a big, expensive failure. And now they're saying, oh, we want to do a drone line like the Maginot Wall in France in 1928, which was useless and expensive. We want to do an EU drone wall. So even the choice of names is ridiculous. Trump must be laughing. Trump and his advisors, they must have a lot of fun when they're listening to the European Commission, and they must think that we are really stupid and incompetent because it's money we can't afford. And once again, military spending sometimes can be good for GDP, economic growth, if you have a big military industry domestically, like America and like China. So when the Americans and the Chinese, when they spend on military weaponry and ammunitions, they help factories and jobs in Oklahoma, Tennessee, Ohio, Shanghai, Beijing. In Europe, when they will spend on military hardware, I'm afraid 70-80% of the money, European taxpayers' money, will go to factories in Minnesota, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. So it's really a disaster for Europe.
Right. Ms. Camilla, with Germany and France worry of EU overreach, how can Brussels enforce joint procurement targets without violating national sovereignty?
Well, first of all, by incentives and transparency, because they never by quotas and command and control action will work. The EDIS numbers are benchmarks, but they are not legally binding quotas. And that's actually really big point. Both Brussels and EDA enforce with carrots, the co-financing, advanced purchase agreement, VAT administrative fund facilitation, and reputational peer pressure through CRD scoreboard. This is a classic EU market integration playbook, shaped by the market, the risk supply, and then capitals will self-select into the common buys because the unit cost and delivery risk are lower. That's what European Commission is willing to do. But in order to actually, let's say, explain a little bit of the European Commission, I hope you don't mind, I would like to highlight that the EU roadmap focuses on industrial search, military mobility, and LEO administrative enablers, plus dual use of infrastructure, all which NATO has long asked European to shoulder. But in the short, this is something that EU shall and the supply chain. And by talking about interoperability and drone use, I will have to highlight it that since quite a long of time, because I would already say that since the new regulation of drones in 2019, EU is already working very extensively interoperability of IT systems of the law enforcement, as well as dronization, is leading that into the dronization of the by Frontex and by Copernicus of the external borders. So this is something which is already, let's say, being deployable when it comes to the police control and control of the borders and migration, especially in the eastern flanks. And in my opinion, this will be something which now is going to be translated into military spendings, into the collective defense, and into actually reviewing the position of European Union to be more than just a donor and humanitarian support, but to actually be as someone who will start and try to harmonize procedures with political commitment to grant cross-border movement permission in order to ensure the sovereignty they would like to really establish again, to go into the effect,
The sovereignty
which is
you mean
regain
here?
global.
The sovereignty you
Yes.
mean here? The sovereignty of Europe at large, or we're speaking here about certain countries who will be carrying out with this project?
What I'm actually meaning here is indeed the first thing, something which Ursula von der Leyen is really keen to ensure, so regaining as much as possible when it comes to the creation of, well, indeed, a federalization of the Europe, but actually creating and recreating a economical and military as well as security, especially in the context of internal security, disaster risk management, and crisis management in global position of the European Union as a global key player. This is indeed, I would say that this is a credible interoperable security actor.
Right.
And this is something not just in the Europe, but as well is in the Mediterranean. Because I don't know, have you heard, but today European Union has as well interpreted revised
Right.
Union for Medtrack, which is a key geopolitical security player. And this is the reason why as well EU would like to remain a key player. Port, cyber hardening, energy corridors, industry partnerships. This is the part of the whole big plan.
But still, you did
indeed
not. But still, you did not tell me if it is the sovereignty of Europe at large, or for certain countries who will be participating. Let me go to Mr. Fazeli, and I will come back to you. Mr. Fazeli, is the EU's drone wall, as described by Ms. By Ms. Camilla here, is it a defensive shield, or a signal to Moscow that Europe accepts permanent confrontation? What do you think it is?
Well, like I said earlier, they're officially saying that they're taking their inspiration from the 1928 French defense minister named André Maginot, who was an imbecile. So the whole European drone wall, according to them, in their own word, is based on André Maginot's 1928 Maginot Line or Maginot Wall. Why do they call it the drone wall? Because Maginot came up with the notion of the Maginot Wall. It's a failure, but it's interesting that they would do so because they are behaving shamelessly. Why am I saying that they're behaving shamelessly? Because law is important and constitutional law is crucial. And if we Europeans don't abide by our own constitutional laws, we are becoming no better than dictators like Vladimir Putin. And what I'm coming at is a lot of these European foreign policy, European common defense policy championed by Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron in the past 3 years are totally illegal. And why are they illegal? And why were they able, the likes of Macron and von der Leyen and the Polish government and the German government, why were they able to, get away with acting illegally? Because there's a power vacuum. And here, Vladimir Putin is an imbecile, because what Vladimir Putin did in the past 3 years by invading these unimportant, frankly, non-essential parts of eastern Ukraine, which are completely meaningless for the geopolitical, geo-economic, on the world, whatever map, eastern Ukraine is irrelevant. But by invading these boring, rusty provinces of the Ukrainian Far East, Putin made a big mistake. He allowed his enemies, and he allowed European federalists like Macron or von der Leyen to operate illegally. Why is it illegal? There's a Roman law, or a Latin law term, which is horror vacui. Horror vacui, what does it mean in political science and constitutional law? Nature hates emptiness. What does it mean, nature hates emptiness? When the Russia-Ukraine war started, there was a power grab in Brussels. People like von der Leyen said, let's not get that crisis passed without profiting from the crisis. So Europe is ruled today by a constitutional legal framework called the Maastricht-Lisbon Constitutional Framework. And within that Maastricht-Lisbon Constitution, military issues and foreign affairs are supposed to represent 2 or 3% of what the EU does. So 96 or 97% of what the European Commission is supposed to focus on are commercial, economic, fiscal, trade, industrial issues, and only 2 or 3% foreign policy and military affairs. And what von der Leyen and Macron did illegally since the start of the Ukraine war, they completely shifted the focus of the EU. And if you look at the agenda of the EU summit, it's mind-boggling. In the past 3 years, 90% of EU summits were devoted only to Ukraine and war and sanctions. Like I said, the EU constitution says they should focus only or mostly on industrial, economic, and trade issues. So they have completely illegally.
So, Mr. Fazeli, because we're running out of time, is it simply a defensive shield, or is it a signal to Moscow that Europe is in confrontation? In 2 words, because I don't have time. I have to go to Ms. Camilla.
It's a power grab. It's a power grab in Brussels and a signal to Moscow, yes.
Right. Ms. Camilla, does the defensive readiness roadmap risk duplicating NATO's Eastern century or deepening essential complementarity? What do you think? Briefly, because we're running out of time.
This is actually something both. Indeed, they're going to do as much as possible to ensure that there are going to be an interpretation which will ensure this issue going to really happen and going to work proactively. But at the same time, indeed, I have to agree with Mr. Fazeli, but this is as well used to actually boost European sector, but as well is as well used to boost European enlargement of competences. So in the both way, to ensure that this is going to happen and it is going to be in the Eastern century to bolster Eastern air ground presence against drone and missile threats, to work together as a EU roadmap focuses, together with Frontex, together with Copernicus geopolitical system. So it is military mobility, legal administrative enablers, industrial sets, dual use infrastructure of police border control, which NATO can use. So the EU is shaft, and this supply chain is going to indeed be
right. That was Ms. Kamila Zawichta, Romanov, Professor of EU Law and Security Studies. We thank you so much. And Ms. Maher Nicholas Fazeli, Director of the EU Asian Center. Thank you both for your very special insights and your valuable discussions here. And I guess that takes us to the end of our episode of Think Tank. We hope Europe races to build a drone wall, but can we ask if that would, if the unity and funding would and the vision turn ambitions into reality or challenge? The clock is ticking, and I guess remains to be seen. Many thanks for watching.